Okay, you were gonna do all those 330 projects at once, right?
Just, you know,
Yeah.
so it turns out you're supposed to watch the lecture slides before lecture videos before doing the project. What? Oh yeah, it sounds normal at 2 times.
Yes, it sounds normal at 2 times.
At 2 times, like when it starts normally, then it's like, dude, super stupid.
I remember I had a professor who would talk very slowly. You put him on like triple speed to normalize. Very entertaining.
Program.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can't. The word, I think, did I tell you guys about it? I already had it installed on my system. I have to like download it and forgotten on it. External plus plus.
Oh yeah, you were talking about that a little bit.
Yeah. It's fantastic. It's one up, but it's terrible, and also free and open source.
I like the open source. Open source is not good.
I can describe the of the list.
Well, that's good open source is not good.
I know what you did. I know what I did. That takes time.
It's like that.
Yes. Did we just like for some out? Oh, actually practice. Whatever that was. Screen. Okay. And I'm due. Pixel 6.
I think that.
Is it good? I haven't looked at the hardware.
You're using your own associates.
kind of climate though. That's really good because my exam grade is not super solid. This is for 450.
Yeah, my grade. This is a lot.
This is my comments. This is good. This is good. This is comment. Go. Good, that was good. I did a low. I always partnered there. That sounds like bad.
Yeah. Basement with the company. Yeah, I did. I got like 11, I think, added to my score. Yeah, I'll take that. Yeah, I don't know why. I just really know it.
I haven't really got an exam from Stanford. Yeah, I have like attended that lecture, but it was designed and analysis and it's been very difficult. Because it's requires you to pick up a little real shit that my body wants. That's
Okay. So did people do this PRQ solved with not Q or R will basically entail. So if you have ERQ in the database, knowledge base, and QRR, not QRR in the knowledge base, then you get to essentially say PRR would be, yeah.
You got rid of
Yeah. PRR would be entailed. Right? So did you guys do this? Anybody get this? Can you do it? So here, P, Q, R, then R, Q, not Q or R, KB, and the fact which is RR. Okay, so all you're doing is, so this is false, 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 true, false, true, true, false, false, true, false, true, 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 false, true, true, true. You guys get this, right? If there are n propositions, then there are 2 power n worlds. So from a propositional logic point of view, if you have n proposition symbols, then there are 2 power n worlds. And each world is a state. So really, if you have n proposition symbols, then you can distinguish between 2 power n states. You understand what I'm saying? That means instead of thinking in terms of searching in the space of 1024 states, you can think of searching in the space of states made up of 10 state variables. So there is like a reduction, compactness. That's the whole point of logics, because the state spaces at atomic level are huge. If you think in terms of the propositions, it's logarithmic essentially, right? The log of the size of the state space to the base 2 is the number of state variables you need. You guys get this? Does this make sense? Okay. And so we'll see how we can reduce it even more as we go into predicate logic and first order logic. For example, first order logic can compactly represent an infinitely large state space. Predicate logic can compactly represent a double exponential amount of state space. Propositional logic can represent an exponential amount of state space. Okay, we'll talk about this more, but think about it that way. And if you do that, then what happens? So, I mean, you should be able to just say this. So tell me, what are these things? CRQ, it should be false, right? False, 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 true, true. Does anybody have any problem with this? First of all, should I do this at all, or is it obvious to people? I mean, if it's obvious, you should have kind of tried it at least. Okay. Then the other, what?
You're doing all right.
It doesn't work.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm doing, okay. Good. Nice. Okay. Okay. So this is still false. This is still false. This is true. This is true. This is true. 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 Yes. Sorry. That's good point. Okay. This junction. Okay. So now for this, not Q or R. So not Q becomes true, because of which this is true. Not Q becomes true. So again, this is true. This will be false or false, will be false. This will be false or true, will be true. This will be true or false, true. True or true, true. False or false, false. False or true, true. Agreed? Now the knowledge base, because this and this are given in the knowledge base. So KB means what has been given. In the knowledge base, all the sentences are together. That means they're conjoined. That means they're conjunction. That means they're ANDed together. So now you need to do essentially the AND of these two rows, these two columns. This is where I get to say false here, false here, false here, true here, true here, true here, false here, true here. Right? That's the knowledge base. Then I need to look at PRR. And in fact, I can also write a different thing called KB and not F. We can do that later. Okay, so the fact that you're trying to prove that's entailed is PRR. So check in each of the words. So these are the words basically. So in each of the words, is PRR here true? No, it's false. About here, true. Here, I'm sorry, PRR, right? Yeah, PRR, it's false here. Here, I'm good. And then this one is the false or true, true, false or false, false, false or true, true, true or false, true, true or true, true, true or false, true, true or true, true. Okay. So at this point, you can do two different things. You can also complete this last column. That would be the cheapest way. That's basically resolution refutation. That's basically proving a refutation. So if you complete the last column, what you get is you have to take the knowledge base column and the negation of the fact column and AND it, right? Okay, so knowledge base column and negation of this one. So false and true will be false. Similarly, false and false will still be false. Essentially, anything, if any one of them is false, it's false. Then this is true and not true. True and false, false. True and false, false. True and false, false. False and true, false. True and true, false. So, you know that if you believe the knowledge base, and you also believed the negation of the fact you are trying to prove, then there is no world where both of these are true. So if you believe in the knowledge base, you have no choice other than to believe the fact that you're trying to entail. That's what, entailment, basically, you don't get to say, I don't feel like believing. I believe P implies Q, but I draw the line there. I won't believe Q. That you don't get to say. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay, so this is basically how you prove. So in this particular case, you have proved that this is the resolution refutation rule is a sound rule of inference. By going back to model theory, which is the truth table based calculation. Once you do this, now you get to use this rule, PRQ. Now that you know that this guy is done, this is a sound rule now. Interestingly, you can use this guy to prove other guys to be sound. For example, if I asked you to prove that modus ponens is actually sound. Modus ponens is P and P implies Q. If you believe in both, then you must believe Q. Okay? What I can do is, I can do this as P is a clause. Okay, if you basically, so P is a clause and P implies Q is nothing but not P or Q. That's a clause. So then you resolve them. You get Q. You see what I'm saying? By the way, one of the interesting things is, so you resolve them, you got Q. So that already told you that it is essentially a sound rule of inference, because it's just a special case. Modus ponens is a special case of resolution rule. In fact, every little rule that you know, such as, for example, P implies Q is true and not Q is true, means not P is true. This is modus tollens, right? This is modus ponens. This is modus tollens. Right? How do I do that? I basically, and I can prove this by saying not P or Q, not Q, not P. Okay, you just have to prove the soundness of this more general rule, and then you can prove everything. But of course, you could have proved the soundness of these guys just by the truth table too. Right? The truth table thing works all the time. Okay. And then, of course, in the truth table thing, the other thing that I mentioned last time is the other thing that I mentioned last time is that instead of doing, if you don't feel like doing this extra column, then the other way of reasoning is you can look at all the rows where the knowledge base is true. All the rows where the knowledge base is true. And make sure that in each of the rows where knowledge base is true, the fact is actually true. The fact you're trying to entail is true. Because all this is saying is each row is a world. And if you believe that the world is made up of just 3 proposition symbols, that means however complex your world is, it really has only 8 equivalence states. You ignore all other differences. The only that you care about are like 3 proposition symbol values. So that means that there really only are 8 states in the world. Of those 8 states, the knowledge base is true in these 4 states, this state, this state, this state, this state. You can actually give it numbers if you want. This is state 1, state 2, state 3, state 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So this thing is true in states 4, 5, 6, and 8. And in all those cases, the fact is actually true. So whenever you are true, you can be sure that the other guy will be true. So it basically follows. Do you guys get this? Now notice that this fact is actually true in this world too. I don't mind that. It can be true in other places. All I care about is in the worlds where the knowledge base is true, the fact also is true. If there exists even one of these rows where the fact is not true, then it is not entailed. Okay, and it's very important to understand what not entailed means. So if there exists a row in which the knowledge base is true but the fact isn't, or if there exists a row in which this last column has a true value, then in those cases you say that KB does not entail the fact. And you should make sure, and I made a big deal about this in the lecture that you heard, that this is not the same as KB entails not F. Do you understand what I'm saying? Because in a world, in any world, like suppose I'm thinking of one world from 1 to 8. In that world, I say Q is not true. Is Q false? In the world, I'm thinking of a particular world, okay, of the 1 to 8, only one world, one specific world. In that world, Q is not true. Is Q false? Yes, because in a given world, it has to be either true or false. The law of excluded middle. There is no middle between true and false in a given world. You guys get that? In a single world, there's either true or false. And if I said it's not true, then it must be false. If I said it's not false, then it must be true. On the other hand, entailment is over a set of worlds. If I now say I'm thinking of a set of worlds, and it's the case that fact P is not true in all those worlds. I mean, remember, this is an English sentence and you have to carefully interpret it. What I'm trying to say is, it is not the case that P is true in all the worlds. For that to be true, P should be false in at least one of the worlds. Right? If P is false in at least one of the worlds, then you're done. Okay? So that's the excluded middle thing that you need to keep track of. And entailment essentially does allow for middle. I don't know whether it's true or false. It's neither, because it's over sets. Right? The difference between logic and probabilistic logic is that if I'm thinking of, let's say, 100 states, and suppose, for example, the knowledge base is true in 100 states. The fact is true in 99 of those states. Is the fact entailed? No. Is the negation of the fact entailed? No. From a logic perspective, I can't say anything about the entailment status of the fact. Probabilistic logic will say, hey, it's like 99 of the world's fact is true. So 99 by 100 is the probability. So if you randomly pick from the worlds where the knowledge base is true, then there is a 0.99 chance that fact will be true in that world. That's probability for you. You see what I'm saying? So in fact, deterministic logic becomes a special case of probabilistic logic when you look at it that way. So it's nice that we actually understand these first. Okay. Okay. So what we would do, any questions on the whole logic thing? Okay. So what we are going to do, what we were doing last class, and I'm going to show it again, is that I was basically showing like how to do theorem proving, propositional theorem proving using resolution. And in particular, I do steps in resolution refutation, which is like the reason you understood how to do. One of the applications of logic is being able to, if I tell you that the following are true, you should be able to say whether other things are true or not. When you say they are true, that means in every world where these things are true, that thing is also true. If there exists at least one world where the knowledge base is true, where the fact isn't, then you will say, I don't know, it's not true. Not true doesn't mean that it's always false. Again, I'm repeating myself, but it's very, very important. People have to understand. Okay, so anyway, so this was the thing that we're looking at. Consider the following, basically a bunch of sentences, and you essentially, normally when trying to write something as a logical problem, you invent proposition names and about statements that are true or false, and then basically write the logical relations between them. So it's not that hard here. So if the grass is wet, then it's either raining or sprinkler is on. So I made up a proposition called GW and implies RRSP. Now, does the name of the proposition matter? No. I mean, I made GW. You guys may have made GRWT. Whatever the heck you want. I mean, it's like the variable name in a program. Does the variable name in the program matter? No. It just needs to be, maybe for the guy who reads the program, it should sort of tell them what it is instead of just saying G005. But as far as, as long as you have a connection between the world's fact, the fact in the world, and the proposition that you decided to represent it by, you're all good. Okay, so you encoded it then. So then this is basically GWR implies RRSP, R implies PH, SP implies TH, etc. And remember, the other thing you need to do is you're trying to prove that grass is not wet. And so before you start doing refutation, you go ahead, negate the fact that you're trying to prove, add it to the mix. And if the fact was actually entailed, then at this point, this mix is combustible because it has no world in which it is true. That means a false has to come out. By the way, the other thing, remember I said empty string is false. I mean, empty clause is false. The reason why that is the case is suppose you are resolving P or not P, you're getting empty. But really, P is nothing but P or false. Not P is nothing but not P or false. False is there with everybody in a disjunctive form as the David, essentially. You just don't mention it. So using resolution P and not P go away, you got false or false, which is false. That's why empty clause is false. Do people get this? It's a syntactic thing, but basically there's always a false. In a disjunctive form where you're writing the clauses, A is nothing but A or false. In the conjunctive form, instead of, A is nothing but A and true. Right? A can be written as A and true in the conjunctive form. In the disjunctive form, A can be written as A or false. And because the falses get left over in the end, that's basically the empty clause. Okay, so you're just going to do resolutions left and right until you find a false clause. The problem, of course, is there are many, many, many things that you can resolve. And the one that will actually lead you to the empty clause to prove this theorem is not necessarily obvious. So in the lecture, did I mention the Sherlock Holmes joke? Okay, so there was many years back, BBC ran a competition about world's funniest joke. BBC British Broadcasting Corporation. And the one that won the, it's like basically people's sexiest man alive kind of nonsense, except this one is a joke. Okay. So the joke that won the competition goes like this. Sherlock Holmes and Watson went on a camping trip. Okay. And after a whole day of roaming around, then they pitched the tent and, they talked to themselves, then they fell asleep. In the middle of the night, Sherlock Holmes, wakes up Watson. Says, Watson, tell me what you see and tell me what you can deduce from that. Remember, that's what Sherlock Holmes is famous for. So Watson says, I see sky, I see stars. Since there are stars, that means sun must have gone down. That basically means sun is going around the earth. That means Copernicus was probably, earth is going around the sun or sun is going around the earth. That means Copernicus was right, and so on and so on and so on. And he's providing large number of deductions. Sherlock Holmes says, Watson, you idiot. It means somebody swiped our tent. That's what I'm saying. You see what I'm saying? There are many things you can prove. But just because you can prove them doesn't mean they're useful. The thing that was most important inference there is in the middle of the night, when you went in and slept in your tent, in the middle of the night, you're seeing stars. The most important thing is somebody swiped our tent. Remember this if you ever wonder whether theorem proving should have search. Of course it has search. You see what I'm saying? Okay. Anyway, so basically I showed you a whole bunch of resolutions, one of which, and finally I was able to, at one sequence, I was able to get an empty class. And the moment I get an empty class, I have in essence proved the theorem. Okay. And this is when I said, is there a search in the inference? Of course, there is a search in the inference. And there are two things that I want to get to first. First, actually get to the search, and I'll come back to this. So the search and resolution essentially is very simple. This is a connection back to A star search sort of things. Today, in fact, is back to basics. We're going to look at combinatorial search, not continuous space search, because these are our discrete spaces. Okay. So what would I do? I'll convert the database into causal form. That's called it DC. I negate the goal first and then convert it into the causal form. I'll call it DG. Then the new database will be a set of classes DC plus DG, DC union DG. Now, having said this, let me just point out that there is an assumption here that any propositional formula can be converted to causal form. Okay. And it turns out that logic, propositional logic, first order logic, all of these have these things called normal forms. And the normal forms essentially, if you write anything, you can always convert it into this compiled form. So think of these classes as the assembly language for logic. You put all these implications, you put these and signs, etc., but you can compile it down into what we care about, conjunctive normal form. Conjunctive normal form essentially is a conjunction of clauses where each clause is a disjunction of literals, where each literal is either a proposition or the negation of it. Okay? Okay. So it turns out that any arbitrary set of logical formulas can be converted into just a set of disjunctive clauses. CNF form, that means a conjunction of disjunctive clauses. There are other forms too. There is another normal form called disjunctive normal form that we won't care about. For those of you who remember your 120, EEE 120, you guys have taken EEE 120, many of you. This is the product of sums, and this is sum of products. You might remember it from there. Okay, so now why is it possible? I kind of already showed you that crazy things like, A is already in the clausal form. A is a class by itself. Okay. A or B is also in a clausal form. Not A is also in the clausal form. A implies B can be put in the clausal form by saying not A or B. If I have not of A or B, it's not in the clausal form. So then I pull the negation inside. Not of A or B is nothing but not of A and not of B. And since it's a conjunctive normal form, you can always remove the conjunction. If you write two clauses, then they are implicitly conjoined. It's like writing, if I write two sentences on the page, then both sentences are there on the page. Right? So that's what it's saying, that there is like a simple procedure that you can follow to convert anything into a CNF form, which is you basically remove the implication, then you pull the negation in, which is what we did here. Then you can use De Morgan's laws to distribute disjunction over conjunction. Again, this stuff went away. So if I have something like A or B, and I mean, so A or B and A, no, actually no. I think that the thing that you need here, okay, De Morgan's laws to distribute disjunction over conjunction. So disjunction over conjunction would be, let me write it down here. Suppose I have A, R, B, and C. That's not in a causal form. So I can write it as A, R, B, and A, R, C. Now I can remove the and. They're like two clauses. See what I'm saying? There's like a mechanical procedure to convert any logical sentence, however complex it is, into a set of clauses. Just like there is a mechanical procedure to convert any C program into assembly language. This is compilation. Right? So once I have done that, and then as I said, in the last one is separate conjunctions into clauses. And the separation of conjunction into clauses is that basically if you have A and B, then you write it as clause A and clause B and remove the and sign. Because you never write in a disjunctive, in a database that is in CNF form, the only symbols that you will ever see are disjunction and negation. That's it. You will never see implication, you will never see conjunction. Conjunction is implicit. Implication is syntactic sugar. You never needed it. Because A implies B is nothing but not A or B. You see what I'm saying? Now that you know that this can be done, you can convert it, then you essentially do believe that I can convert the database into clausal form. I can negate the goal and convert it to clausal form. And there's a bunch of clauses, union of all these clauses is the big set of clausal database. Okay. Now what do? I go through this big loop. Select a pair of clauses C1 and C2 from this database D. Resolve them if they can be resolved. If they can be resolved, you will get a new clause. Add it to D. If the new clause you got is empty clause, jump up and down, say prove, and go home. If not, continue going through this loop. That's the search. The only question is, how do I make sure I don't go into loops? So for example, when you come out of this loop, that means you have done all resolutions that can ever be done between either the original clauses or the clauses that resolve from the previous resolutions or some combination thereof. Everything that can be resolved has been resolved. You still didn't find an empty clause. If you come here, then you say the fact is not entailed. You see what I'm saying? And if you are coming out through here, if in fact you get an empty class and you get out return from here, then you say the fact is entailed. The difference between propositional logic and first order logic, in fact, the first order logic procedure almost looks like this. The difference is you can never get out of this loop in the case of first order logic, because the number of potential resolutions in the first order logic winds up being infinite. Which is why, remember what I said, it is semi-decidable. If the theorem was actually provable, then there would be some finite sequence of resolutions that will lead to an empty class. And if you use a complete search mechanism, it will always look at the finite depths before looking at the infinite depths. So it will be decidable, that's all. If the theorem is not provable, you may never come out. So the universe has ended and you're wondering, is it because the theorem cannot be proved, or is the theorem is actually false? You know, you cannot say either. That's why it's semi-decidable. So the point then is, how can I improve this search? You want heuristics. Remember, A-star search has heuristics. So what are the heuristics here? It turns out that there's some two cute heuristics I can talk about. One is essentially how are you select, the heuristics are about how you are selecting the pair of clauses that you're going to resolve. The first idea says, don't just pick any pair of clauses, pick at least one of the clauses such that it came either from the original negated goal. I mean, either it is one of the clauses from the original negated goal or a descendant. So this is like the royal blood. Okay, goal clauses, the ones that you threw in through DG, they all are royal. They have set of support. Any clause, every clause that you add in will have two parents, right? Because you are resolving two clauses. If one of the parents has set of support, then the child will have set of support. So you should ensure that you'll only do resolution between a pair of clauses when at least one of them has set of support. One of them has royal blood, the gold blood. So you can think of set of support as has gold blood. Pretty gory, but that's set of support is like royal blood. Okay. This is, if I use this heuristic, clearly I'm not doing some of the resolutions. You agree, right? Because there would have been more resolutions that the original procedure does. I'm cutting down a whole bunch of them. In fact, if you don't believe me, I mean, if you're not able to visualize, here are the pictures that show this is the set of resolutions that are done if you do full breadth first search. And this is the set of resolutions that are done if you're doing set of support. And you notice it's sparse. There are some edges missing. You see what I'm saying? Like in particular, right? In particular, anything which doesn't have, anything which has two parents, neither of which are goal-based, essentially will not be resolved. But the interesting thing is this heuristic good? What does it mean to say good? In the case of A-star search, when we considered good heuristics, we considered admissibility of the heuristic. Admissibility meant that with the heuristic, you got the same optimal solution as without the heuristic. Optimality can be defined in two different ways. Here you might say, if you got the shortest proof, then it is optimal. But do we really care about having shortest proof? We just want to see whether it's probable or not. You understand what I'm saying? All we really care about is whether I can prove it. So if there are a few extra steps before I get to the empty class, I don't care. As long as for every theorem that is provable, I am able to get the empty class. You guys get this? So I define admissibility in a different way in this case because I don't care about the length anymore. I just care of completeness. And it turns out that the set of support is a complete strategy. Set of support is a complete strategy. Okay. It will ensure that any fact that is actually, so, and again, it intuitively makes sense. The expectation is that the knowledge base was consistent, that there exists at least some worlds where the knowledge base holds true. And the only reason the negation of the goal makes the knowledge base inconsistent is because it removes all the worlds. So which means that somehow the goal or one of its descendants have to play a part in getting the empty class. The reason it won't be the shortest, if you want to get a counterexample for why it is not shortest, imagine that the initial database is 10,000 facts long and it has F and P and not P inside it. Right? If I allowed you, you cannot do P and not P resolution because neither of them are goal clauses. They are the original database clauses. So there's a false staring at you. You got the empty class, you could have gone home, but you won't stop there. You have to somehow get this false while using one of the goal clauses. So it might be longer sometimes, but who cares? It will definitely catch all the cases where the goal is actually attained by the database. The reason I'm going through this more slowly than actually in the textbook, this is like a couple of paragraphs, but it's kind of nice to see that different parts of the course are connected. So this is A-star search really being customized to work with theorems. And this is how the heuristics look like. And you don't care about the length of the proof. In fact, mathematicians have all sorts of interesting complexes, right, as to whether or not a proof is quote unquote elegant. Okay, in fact, the Fourcareau theorem that some of you may have heard of, has been proven using a computer, and mathematicians still saying, that's not real proof. And if you ask Paul Erdős, who is this mathematician par excellence, who had basically lived out of his suitcase, would go sit somewhere with his suitcase, hang around for a bunch of months, write papers and go off. And he's written so many papers. You know about Erdős, right? How many of you know of Paul Erdős? He was so prolific a writer of mathematical papers that there is a concept of Erdős number. Erdős himself has the Erdős number 0. Anybody who wrote a paper with Erdős has Erdős number 1. Anybody who wrote a paper with somebody who wrote a paper with Erdős has Erdős number 2. Then I come in, Rao has Erdős number 3. Right? I mean, where is Rao and where is Paul Erdős? That guy was so prolific that he's written papers with random numbers of people, who then wrote papers with random numbers of people, that even though I never did a number theory paper in my life, I'm still only Erdős number 3. Some of you might have heard of an equivalent other version, Kevin Bacon game. Right? And I actually probably am one of the few people who also has a finite Kevin Bacon number, because I have an IMDb page. I'm an actor and all that stuff. So it's very hard to get both an Erdős number, a finite Erdős number, and a finite. So you should take selfies after the class. But anyway, I digress. But the point is that essentially, Erdős would say that a proof is beautiful to him. He would say it's straight from the God's book of proofs. He didn't care about God who takes care of routine illnesses like cold. God, I hope I won't have common cold kind of nonsense. He only cared about a God who writes apparently beautiful proofs in a big book. And so he would say it's inelegant if it is straight from the God's book. So he'll basically make funny faces if you say these are proofs, because we don't care about how long the proof is, you just prove it. Okay, this is what I'll keep in mind. Here is an incomplete heuristic. This one is actually even more efficient, but it is incomplete. The incomplete heuristic says at least one of the clauses C1 or C2 must be directly from the original DC. So one of the pair of clauses must be from the original input clauses. Whereas this guy doesn't care. They can basically be descendants and descendants and descendants being resolved. At least one of the pair has set of support. This one is called linear input form strategy. It's even faster. It cuts down even more. It cuts down even more resolutions. But it is incomplete. However, it is complete if you have only Horn clauses. So what the heck are Horn clauses? The Horn clause is a clause with at most one positive literal. Syntactic test, right? So for example, P or Q, Horn clause or not? No. P or Q is not Horn clause because P is positive, Q is positive. P or Q is not Horn clause. Not P or Q. Is it Horn clause? Yes. You see where this is coming from. Things like not P or Q can be written as P implies Q. So if you have a knowledge base which is full of implications, just implications, simple implications, where the left-hand side of the implication is a conjunction of positive literals, right-hand side of the implication is a single positive literal. That is A and B and C implies D. D and G implies K. K implies M. You see what I'm saying? And similarly, if I just have a single fact like A is true, that's a clause. Is clause A Horn clause? Yes. Have any of you heard of a crazy language called Prolog? How many of you heard? What do you think Prolog does? This is what it does. This is exactly what it does. Prolog basically writes something like A and B implies C as C if A comma B period. Prolog essentially is a Horn clause logic language, and it uses linear input form strategy. Somebody should ask a sanity question here if they're alive. Okay, first of all, you have to realize that Horn clause databases are a subset of normal databases. In particular, for Horn clause databases, modus ponens is complete. You will never have to do case analysis for Horn clause databases. Prolog does basically modus ponens all the time. It doesn't do resolution. It doesn't need to do resolution. Which basically means that it should not be able to prove some theorems because resolution is complete. Horn clause and modus ponens is a subset. But you also were told, bamboozled, into thinking that whatever you can write in C, you can write in Prolog. And any of you actually programmed in Prolog? Those of you who programmed in Prolog, you realize it's a very different mindset. Right? Basically, there is no quote unquote no control knowledge. You tell it what you know, and it does whatever it does. Almost like the new AI. Except you no longer have to tell it, do this first, do this next, etc. No control is provided. Right? Those of you who did Prolog, do you know there is a little control that you provide? there is this cut operator in Prolog. So although you say it's completely up to you how you manage these facts, you say no, but I do want to micromanage a little bit. I'll give you the cut operator. It's the cut operator that makes Prolog non-logical. And one more thing Prolog does, which is very strange, is if it cannot prove something, it assumes the negation of it is true. And we know that that's logically nonsense. But tell that to Prolog. Then basically Prolog says, instead of saying I'm stupid, it says I use closed world assumption. In a closed world assumption, I know the full state. So if I know that F is not true, then F must be false. With those, you get, with those two things on top of modus ponens, Hahn clauses, you get Prolog. Impressed? When you thought you were just learning, no, basically propositional logic. I mean, of course, Prolog is a little more than that. It's not just proposition symbols, it uses predicate symbols. It says loves X, Y kind of a thing, but we'll get to that. It turns out that's not that hard to do it. Okay. Anyway, so this would be the search tree for the linear input form strategy. That will be different. Okay. It'll be even smaller, but it's incomplete for full search. But it's complete for just modus ponens. Okay. One other thing is, if you are actually trying to do in the exam or something, trying to prove, trying to show that the empty class exists, none of you really do the full search because you are not computers. So you will try to kind of look for some sequence like the one I showed here, which will end in empty class. And especially if the exam is time limited, you need the damn empty class as soon as possible. So you start hallucinating empty classes everywhere. And there are some obvious ways. Although, as I said, every unhappy student is unhappy in a different way. There is some common unhappy patterns in this, and I want to bring them up just so that you will never do that. So first of all, remember that you must have everything in CNF before you resolve. And that includes taking the goal, negating it, converting it into a CNF form, and then start doing resolution. The steps matter. Okay. The other thing is, this is something that people love to do. P or Q, not P or not Q. There's a bigger empty class. Because before only P and not P were going up. Now Q and not Q are also going up. My God, it must be even bigger empty class. No. In fact, the resolution rule only says P or Q, not P or not Q. You can either write the resolutions that you can write, or if you consider P or not P to be removed, then you will get Q or not Q. You see what I'm saying? Or if I consider to resolve on Q, then I'll get P or not. Neither of which is. I mean, it's like when you are looking for end of the world, you get universal truth, true. Basically, Q or not Q is universally true. It's a tautology. That's not what you wanted to see. You wanted to see false class, and you just find it by basically calling it false class. That's wrong. In particular, if there is an empty class, it better be the case that the original two clauses are inconsistent. That means there is no world. There is no world where both clauses can be true. That's not true here. So in fact, it can't be empty class here. So just remember that resolution only says pick one literal and its negation from each of the clauses and then just remove them. You can't say, wow, if I can do one, I can do more at the same time. suddenly I get a bigger empty class. No, that doesn't work. The other thing in general, a heuristic, do resolutions that reduce class length. Right? You understand what I'm saying? Basically, if the new class is not smaller than the original classes, then you're not making the progress towards empty class. Okay, that's all I would want to say. This is nothing to do with actually writing on computer. This is more to do with how to do this correctly in the class, in class exam, or if you're trying to do it under pressure. Okay. Okay, so propositional inference, the full propositional inference complexity is co-NP complete, because I told you that satisfiability is NP complete problem. Propositional inference is conjugate of it, because propositional inference says a set of formulas are not satisfiable. Remember that last column had to be all false. That means there is no world where KB and not fact is true. That means it's unsatisfiable. So theorem proving is essentially equivalent to checking that some facts are some database is unsatisfiable. So it's a conjugate of showing that there exists a world. That's why it's co-NP complete. Okay. Then the other thing is that for the Hahn class sentences, that means if all the sentences are Hahn classes, that means there is no class which more than one positive literal, then you can do theorem proving just using modus ponens. That means all theorems that can be proven from such a database can be proven just by using modus ponens. In that case, for that restricted type database, theorem proving is polynomial. Which is why people love Hahn classes in logic. People try to think in terms of implications, and that's how Prolog works, as I told you. In fact, normally, if you have time, you will wind up writing your own Prolog interpreter as part of the class, and it's basically just doing the theorem. Okay. The other thing is that there is, of all the resolutions, there is a resolution called the unit resolution, which is a special class. A unit resolution is one where at least one of the pair of classes is unit length. The good thing about unit resolution is when you apply unit resolution, the resulting class has to reduce in size. Right? What I'm saying is, I have P, R, Q, R, W, and I resolve with a not W clause, I'll get P, R, Q. The class length reduced from 3 to 2. So you do a bunch of unit resolutions, then nicely things become smaller and smaller, and you'll get empty class. That's the dream. Just running unit resolution to completion on a database. All the unit resolutions that are possible, you do it. That can be done in basically linear time. So one of the things that you will see in the next part of the discussion is you will run unit resolution as part of something called satisfiability solver, satisfiability check, which is in trying to figure out a world where a bunch of facts are true, trying to find the world. You will in the middle do theorem proving, but you don't do the full theorem proving, you do small theorem proving like the unit resolution, because it's cheap enough to do. Okay. So proposition logic, basically that you understood till now, which already has a whole bunch of applications that should not be surprising to you. Basically, there is obviously, I kept talking about how it leads you to predicate logic and first order logic. I'll get to that slowly, not yet. But it winds up being useful in doing search over propositional states. That is basically doing full on A star search, except the states are not black boxes. but the states are propositions. What propositions are true in that state? You do that, that's essentially a version of the search that is lifted, what's called lifted search, because it's now much more efficient to do that search than doing the search on the atomic states. We will talk about this, that is called planning, logic-based planning. Okay. The other thing that I want to talk about today is propositional logic can be used not only to find true theorems, but also to find a model. That means if I give you a whole bunch of facts, a whole bunch of clauses, can you give me the truth falsity assignment over these clauses, over these propositions, such that all clauses are satisfied? In doing this, it turns out that there's a whole set of problems that essentially become solvable by that technique. In a weird way, satisfiability checking is even more useful than theorem proving. You know that satisfiability and theorem proving are yin and yang, right? Showing something is unsatisfiable is the way you prove a theorem. Okay, so here is an interesting way of looking at it. So think of, as I said, each clause. Remember last class I mentioned, I don't know how many people caught, is that anytime I give you a clause, anytime I give you a logical sentence, that's a constraint on the number of words that you think are possible. A person with an empty mind believes in every damn magic. You, having taken physics, cannot believe in magic. Like if you, for example, see something like my pen, I leave it and it just slowly floats up, you should freak out. You see what I'm saying? Because you know more knowledge, and regarding those knowledge, this kind of worlds are not possible unless the pen site winds up having some, some funny thing is going on. Essentially, it's not what you expected. So knowledge constrains. Knowledge is a constraint. It's a weird thing. You would say knowledge makes you free. No, knowledge doesn't make you free. Knowledge constrains you from hallucinating about the worlds that don't exist. So you no longer believe in QAnon if you have knowledge, for example. Okay, because it constrains what you can believe. So it turns out that this is basically checking if there is a world where a bunch of knowledge clauses hold together can be thought of as a constraint satisfaction problem, CSP, which is another chapter in the textbook. So I'm basically hitting like two birds with one stone in discussing this. This is satisfiability, which is called Boolean satisfiability, and is extremely close to this other problem called constraint satisfaction, finite domain variable constraint satisfaction problem, where you have a bunch of constraints and you're finding an assignment of values to the variables such that all constraints are satisfied. Okay, let's have a party. This is a small party example, right? I'm going to hold a party and I have some problems. I mean, I'm going to call Joe, Tom, and Mo to the party, and some other people maybe. But it turns out that not all of them can be in the party, and because they might start yelling at each other and kill themselves. It turns out one constraint is either not Joe or not Tom. That's one constraint. Okay, not J or not T. That's one of my constraints. That's a clause. The other clause is either Tom or not Mo. That means either T or not M. The third constraint is not Joe or Mo. That is not J or M. These are my constraints. Now call me a party. Who should I call and who not call? Basically, what I'm trying to say is if T is true, that means I'm asking Tom to come to the party. If T is false, I don't send a mail to Tom. Of course, Tom will find from Joe that there's a party and he'll yell at me. That's a whole different story. That's outside of this course. But I don't send a mail to Tom to ask him for the party. That means true T is false. clearly you guys can, this is basically like the GRE or SAT or analytical test, basically. You can do this. But what's more interesting is that this kind of problems, finding truth falsity assignments to J, T, and M, there are only basically 8 possible assignments, right? For JTM, there are 3 variables. So there are only 8 possible assignments. You want to see if any of these assignments are such that all constraints are satisfied in that assignment. If so, that is a happening party. You guys get this? So this is party planning. But party planning is connected to timetabling. It's also connected to job scheduling. It's also connected to chip design. One of the biggest consumers of satisfiability solvers, it turns out, is Intel, NVIDIA, etc. Except they won't be having just 3 clauses. They could have millions of clauses with thousands of variables, thousands of proposition variables. And it doesn't become that easy to solve it. You see what I'm saying? And then in the end, scheduling, military logistics, Sudoku. Any of you know Sudoku? Sudoku is basically a satisfiability checking ESP problem. So this little thing which we just passed over it to get to the theorem proving, because that's what we wanted to do, the satisfiability, is a great problem all by itself. And the interesting question then is, how do you solve the satisfiability problem? Once again, it's a search. It's basically, we're going to remember all the A-star search stuff, except with, just like in the theorem proving, there are some specializations. It's a lovely specialization. CSP is an entire separate chapter in the textbook because these problems are important enough and they are much simpler than the general search. In what ways are they simpler? We'll see that next. So here is an idea. So this is the kind of search I can do. I can say, look, in the end, I need to figure out whether or not everybody, for everybody, I need to figure out what the value is. Joe, Tom, and Mo. Right? So a simple idea is pick an order. So let's say I'm going to work with Joe first. Joe can either be called to the party or not called to the party. That's a choice. So the search tree now has split into 2 branches. Now, if for Joe to be called, then imagine I'm going to consider Tom. Tom can be either called to the party or not called to the party. And then similarly, then if I survive, then Mo can be either called to the party or not called to the party. After I do this, every leaf node is going to correspond to one of the 8 assignments. Agreed? And if in fact you reach that leaf node, that means in fact in that assignment all the constraints are satisfied. I said that because if ever a partial assignment already made it clear that there is no party, that means with that partial assignment you cannot essentially give any assignment, any complete assignment. There's no way of, so that basically means this partial assignment already violates a constraint. Once the constraint is violated, adding other values to other variables is not going to change this dead constraint. You people get this? Once a constraint is violated, you can stop search under that branch. Right? So this is what happened here. So Joe, Tom, true. If Joe is true and Tom is true, then it turns out that constraint 1 is not satisfied. You can check that. Because of which there is no point in going below this. Now here there's only one more variable left. But imagine there were 1,000 variables. And I killed it after the first 2 variable assignment. I saved myself like 998 size tree. 998 variable size tree. That means 2 power 998 is the size of that tree. See what I'm saying? Every failure in that you detect improves the speed of the search. It's perverse. What you're trying to see is to find a party that is feasible. But your heuristic should be fail as fast as possible in every branch. Every failure cuts down the search. So in fact, the heuristics for CSP wind up being dependent on this fail first principle. Fail as soon as you can. If you're going to fail anyway, failing it after 2 variables is better than failing after a lot more. So imagine the following thing. Joe and Tom was going to be true, except between Joe and Tom, I consider all the other variables. And then in the end, I start trying to make Tom to be true. All those branches are dead. The sad part about dead constraints is they basically have dead children and dead descendants. Beautiful terminology. Right? Okay. And in fact, good search is not to try to expand dead people, dead states. I don't know why I'm thinking of people. Okay. Because a dead state is dead. And you expand it, it has more dead states. They're all dead too. And eventually you're full of large numbers of states, you're feeling humongous amount of progress is being done, but they're all dead. The faster you can see that this is a dead state, the better off you are. This is actually a good heuristic in life. If you're trying to figure out, should I do A, should I do B? Try to do the thing that you think you're more likely to hate fast. And see if you hate it badly enough that you not do it. And then you can get back to the other one. Failing first is a good thing, if you're not sure. See what I'm saying? So one interesting question is, this is indeed the search. I said that search is that I sort of look at the variables order. First question, do I need to backtrack on the order in which I considered the variables? Do I need to backtrack on the order in which I considered the variables? It's a subtle question. It turns out you do not need to, but you should convince yourself of that. That reduces the search space quite a bit. You just basically pick any order and you never have to backtrack on the order of the variables. You only need to backtrack because of the failures. Agreed? The second question, yes, go ahead.
Does work on like a ternary logic system?
What?
Does work on like a ternary logic system, so like true or false?
Yeah. In fact, normal CSPs basically have multi-valued variables. That's the only difference. This is Boolean logic. If you have Boolean logic, you call it satisfiability problem. If you have a generalized CSP, will be a finite domain variable. Each variable has a finite domain. Doesn't have to be two-sized. And then there are constraints about what values various variables can take together. That's CSP. And the idea will work for CSP too. There is a slight difference between SAT and CSP. SAT is a slightly special case. However, SAT is a canonical problem. Any CSP problem can be compiled down into SAT. The strangest thing is if I said SAT, in fact, this was from like a science fair thing somebody did. And when they said SAT, everybody in the room assumed SAT as SAT. In computer science, there's only one SAT, not the one you took to get into the school, the Boolean satisfiability problem. Okay. So anyway, outside of this room, basically, if you say SAT, we talked about SAT, they think, oh, hopefully you'll get a good score. But they're talking about the wrong, nonsensical kind of a SAT. This is the better SAT. This is a satisfiability problem. So first is the variable order doesn't matter. I mean, you don't have to backtrack on the variable order. The second is, does the order that you wind up picking matter? Does the order that you wind up picking matter? It turns out it actually very much can. In the following way, and I mean, I've talked CSP for such a long time that there was a time when Bill Gates was like the busiest man. Now he has nothing to do, poor guy. But so I would say, suppose you're trying to hold a party where you're trying to decide the date for the party where everybody can come, but you're going to call Bill Gates as well as me. I always was ambitious in my life, and hopeful. So you're going to call Bill Gates as well as me. So you need to decide who to call first and see what their what potential, times where they are available, and then call the other guy to see are you available on that day. Right? That's the variable order. This is what you guys do if you are a grad student or if you are an honors thesis and you need to get a committee. There are 3 people. One is Bill Gates, one is Rao, one somebody else. You're trying to put all of them in a room at the same time. So you have to ask them, when are you available? Who would you call first to check whether they're available? And who would you call next? And think very carefully, because I'm one of the players. On one hand, you can disrespect me. You understand what I'm saying? The reality is, if you don't want to disrespect me, you will call me. I say, oh, sure, party, of course, I'm available all the time. I'm available Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, any time of the day. So you pick one of my times and go ask Bill. Are you kidding? I'm not available that day. Then you pick another time from me and go ask Bill. Screw you, I'm not available then either. So you're much better off asking Bill first, are you available at all? I say, who the heck are you? And you say, no party. You're done. Do you understand what I just said? What did you do? Most constrained variable first. Most constrained variable first. You pick the order of the variables in the search such that you pick the most constrained variable first. And then, having picked that variable, you pick the value that is least constraining value. So suppose it turns out that Bill Gates says, I'm only really available at 2 times in the entire year. One is this Monday at 10 o'clock. The other is Thanksgiving Day at 4:30 p.m. You realize that Thanksgiving Day at 4:30 p.m. is a very constraining value, because non-losers will probably be having like dinners and lunches with their families. So nobody wants to go. Even Rao might not want to go for the party. So you ask Rao, would you come for a Monday party rather than would you come for a Thanksgiving party? I might probably come for the Thanksgiving party too, but you don't know that. So you will first ask the Monday party. So most constrained variable first, least constraining value first. If you do that, you use that in the search, then you got search going. 2 questions before you go off. What search strategy will you use? Breadth first or depth first? Depth first. Won't you go off to infinite depth? Would you go off to infinite depth? No, because this tree will have as much depth as the number of variables. There is no infinite depth. So you will always do depth first search. Second, would you do iterative deepening depth first search? Unless you're stupid, you would not do iterative deepening depth first search, because all successful parties live at the last level. All successful parties live at the last level. Not all nodes at the last level are successful parties, but if there is a successful party, everybody's value should be decided by them. So they would be at the last level. So you do just depth first search. Most constrained variable, least constraining value. That's your A-star search for this. We'll come back and pick it up.
I used to imagine people today, you're like, you know what sounds